annual Popcorn Forum. We're so glad that you have joined us for this evening. My name is Rhena Cooper, and I teach microbiology here at North Idaho College, and a good friend of Tony Stewart's. And Tony's done favors for me before, so my favor in return tonight is moderating at the Popcorn Forum. Our theme today has been free speech and press versus censorship. So we're continuing with that theme this afternoon, and we have a panel that is prepared to talk a little in response to the presentations this morning, and to maybe add to that or extend or to look at their views, etc. And at the end of their particular presentations, then we will also open up the floor for questions from the audience. I'd like to first start with some introductions so that you know who we have sitting up here today. And so if you guys will smile big or wave when I say your name. So we have Jessica Beener, who's with the NIC Students for Change Club. We have Aubrey Black, who is also with the NIC Students for Change Club. We also have Emily Compton, who is the Vice President of the NIC student body. We are also welcoming Norm Gissel, who is an attorney, and Linda Payne, who is also an attorney in the Kootenai County Public Defender's Office. And so we have quite a variety in our panel this morning, or this evening, I should say. And so first to give you a little bit of a presentation, please welcome Jessica Beener.
Thank you, everybody. Is it on? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight to listen to this. And I'd like to extend another thank you to Tony Stewart for allowing me to be on this panel tonight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the two presentations we had earlier today and kind of throw in some of my personal opinions on different things. First, this morning, we had James Vichet, who kind of took the more broad interpretation of the First Amendment. He talked about how the issue of free press and speech versus censorship cannot be as simple as black and white. There's always some room for censorship, not necessarily to the same extent as others believe, but an opinion, or one of the things that he talked about was how obviously nobody feels like their child, a young child, should be exposed to pornography on the internet. This doesn't necessarily mean that all forms of censorship are okay by his view, but James also talked about his opinion that people should be allowed to criticize our president and our government without having punishment come back upon them. It's allowed by the First Amendment. Another reason James gave for some censorship was people want to be protected from things that are unpleasant to them, which it just is still a personal issue that I don't really feel the government should necessarily decide for everyone what you consider to be obscene or not. Gary Mahara took the more narrow interpretation of the First Amendment by saying that the First Amendment does not say that all speech and press is protected, that only some of it is. One example he gave was that no one should be able to give out military information, such as where our troops are being stationed or what their objectives are. However, I agree with him that troop information like that should not be given out to the public, but I also don't agree with him that the government can censor the news on, say, the caskets coming home from Iraq right now cannot be shown on the news with the flags. They're censoring that, and I just feel that if the news would be able to show this on TV, it would make Americans realize more that there are actual bodies coming back from Iraq now. It's not just numbers adding on, kind of like a sporting event. The numbers just keep getting higher and higher. It'd make things more real, and so I don't feel that should be censored. And Gary finished with that there should be some restrictions on speech and press, but again, it's just kind of more for the individual. Thank you. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Aubrey Black.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Tony first of all, for involving me in this, and everyone who put together the Popcorn Forum this year. I think it's really getting off to a great start. And I'd also like to say that I'm a 23-year-old NIC student. I am no expert in censorship or the media. It's an interest of mine, so I have a lot of opinions, which isn't too hard for me to come up with. But but I'm not an expert. I don't have a whole lot of figures. I actually learned a lot from the debate this morning and the subsequent events and discussions. I came into this with basically a perspective of a very broad and pretty strict interpretation of the First Amendment. I think it's very important. And one of the more enlightening things for me came from Mr. Mahara's argument. He really sort of listed a lot of exceptions to the First Amendment that we have that I wasn't really aware of. And a lot of them make a lot of sense, and they just, they're there for the benefit of our society. So that kind of brought in a new perspective for me. And also some other aspects of his discussion were really interesting. He talked somewhat, he seemed to sort of advocate local censorship and how we already have different standards of censorship, have different standards of each and every community, and how Coeur d'Alene is different than each parts of California. And I thought I'd never heard that perspective before put in that way, and I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think there's a lot of directions that we could go with this, and just talking about the First Amendment, and they're all great paths to follow. But it's my personal opinion that when we talk about censorship, there's one essential question that we have to ask, and that is the press fulfilling its role in our republic? And it has a very important role, and it's to provide the tools for us to be informed citizens so that we can participate in this government. And in our own lives, our own societies, and making our own choices, because if we don't have an informed populace, even a very free country can easily become a form of oligarchy. And I really believe that. And I think that leads me to an issue that came up in some of the discussions after the debate that is sort of outside the original framework of just talking about the legal issues related to the First Amendment. And that is the media consolidation and the private influence over what is out there in our airwaves. And I would kind of like to expand the conversation to that. I don't want to digress too far, but I would like to hear your opinions on that, because I'm still learning and I'm still trying to figure this all out. So I guess that's all I have to say for now. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Aubrey, thank you very much. And next we'll hear from Emily Compton.
Well, thank you, Tony. I would really like to thank you for having this popcorn forum. I think it's sort of vital to the student population. And thank you again for helping out with ASNIC. All that you do is wonderful. This will be the first time I've ever responded to a debate, so bear with me. There was 2 points, actually, one from Mr. Vichet and one from Gary Mahara. Mahara first, sort of touching on what Aubrey said, our censorship basing on the morals and beliefs of a community. I'm from a very tiny town in Montana. Population is probably more in this room. And things that you would do and talk about and express in a community like that is completely different from Coeur d'Alene or Seattle or LA or Spokane. So I'm curious to hear how you think people react to different situations, different topics that come up in the media. I know back home, Iraq, and all the information that we can get, we have a lot of boys that are over there. like she said, but any information that the media gets, people grab onto. And I think the less they get, the more worried people get. But on the other side, completely opposite, or not opposite, but different sort of streamline here from Mr. Vacher, talking about should people be punished if someone becomes offended, and where do we draw that line between offense and information and how people react to that? Can we draw that line? I don't know. These are kind of questions that I don't really think I can answer, but hopefully we can get some questions on that. And that's sort of what I'm interested to see, those two topics. How you guys think morals and beliefs shape a community, and what is acceptable censorship and what is not. And also, if possible, can you draw a line where offense becomes critical to that censorship?
Thank you, Emily. And next, we will hear from Norm Gissel.
I want to warn the three panelists ahead of me that just spoke. You should never thank Tony for anything, because once you do, you become an indentured servant. And it goes on for decades and decades, as many of us in this room can testify to. And that's an exercise of free speech, and I'm... I once said hello to him, and for the next 2 years I was in the middle of planning a women's conference, and I still don't know how that happened, right? There's a couple of things that I wish that the panelists, or that our speakers would have talked about, and the first is that the First Amendment is an expression of human power. The power in a democratic society, the power of government comes from the people. That's the predicate basis for all democracies. And before the government is formed, then we have complete and absolute freedom of speech on every subject, in any forum and in any venue. When we have government, we cede certain amounts of power to them, and there's certain things that we can't do, which is, as correctly pointed out, we can't yell fire in a theater, and we can't describe state secrets in public that we know about, and things of that nature. And we can't deliberately declare falsehoods. We can't slander somebody, and things of that nature. But those are powers that are taken from us by our mutual desire to organize in a society. But the healthier a society is, and the stronger society is, you can argue that it's because it has as many freedom of speech values that you possibly can give to a person. And so America is deeply valued because we have a deep and abiding love and respect for the First Amendment, and that every time we take away those values, then we decrease the power of each one of us. So we do that very deliberately. When we take away a speech freedom, we have to do it very deliberately and very carefully. Another thing that they should have talked about was what's happening now is that they're maintaining, a huge discretionary function in the exercise of freedom of speech. The FCC, for example, here recently, I listened to a talk by the FCC, the head of the FCC, or one of the directors, and he was saying that they don't ban words per se from going over the public airways. They just want everybody to behave decently. Well, what they've done, they've taken the objectivity of saying you can't say certain words, and they have made it subjective by saying you have to behave decently. Well, behaving decently is if I have the power of censorship over you, and it's my belief that you're behaving indecently, That is a tremendous amount of power. And what the effect of that is in the national media is that you say less and less on fewer and fewer subjects because you don't want to be fined these larger and larger fines that the FCC can now assess. So while they say that's actually more freedom and more objective, the reverse is true. And you have less freedom of the press today than you did 5 months ago on that very issue, just that issue alone. So the government is constantly manipulating itself to take from you your freedoms, and it is our duty as citizens to constantly manipulate ourselves to maintain the freedoms that we have. And there's this huge contest that goes on under every administration, and certainly under this one, to reverse the freedoms that we take away the freedoms that we have in large measure, and it's our job as citizens to keep those freedoms as many as we can. And that, I think, is the predicate set of debates that we have to go forward with.
Thank you, Norm. And next we'll hear from Linda Payne.
And I won't thank Tony either. He's sucked me in many times. Just so we're clear about what we're talking about here today, I'm just going to read a part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. That's the issue that we're here on today. And I'll comment a little bit on what other people have said here. And I was at the forum this morning as well. Excuse me, I have short legs. I have to move forward. Professor Vacher did take an absolutist view, and he did a mostly absolutist view. I think he agrees with most everybody in this country that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You cannot defame a person and ruin their business. The issue that, or the case, I think that you were referring, maybe I can't remember which one, I'm sorry. They were talking about the case that was heard in front of the U.S. Supreme Court today called Torrey versus Cochran, and that's Johnny Cochran, the famous lawyer. What had happened is that Mr. Cochran was Mr. Torrey's lawyer. He didn't like Mr. Cochran, and so he wound up going down to his office, picketing, saying a lot of really defamatory things regarding Mr. Cochran and his business and his work. So Mr. Cochran then sued Mr. Torrey and was found, and Mr. Torrey was found liable for defamation. So Mr. Torrey, and then in the process, what the judge has done, in addition to awarding a fine or a judgment, he had also enjoined Mr. Torrey and I think his wife and his press secretary from making any statements at all regarding Mr. Cochran. So Mr. Torrey was saying that that is a violation of his freedom of speech, and he took it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was argued today in front of the Supreme Court. So you might want to hear what the Supreme Court thinks about that. Give it 6 or 8 months. But that was what one of the issues they were talking about today. When I listened to Mr. Maher, the biggest problem that I had with his thoughts and his opinions was that he was saying that we as a society, basically, that it's up to the individual morals, okay? We're not talking about what we should do as individuals and what our particular morals are. This isn't about what somebody says in, Montana. This is about the government restricting our speech. This is about the government withholding information. okay? Not telling us things that we have the right to know. And many of you people may remember the Pentagon Papers and the whole issue with that and Watergate many, many years ago. That's probably the biggest first issue. I was in high school back then, and that was a very dominating factor in my life and what I thought about freedom of the press and government being involved in that. The problem with Mr. Maher's thought was, one thing he was saying was that he was citing a case, a U.S. Supreme Court case we know as Miller, and he's talking about a community standard, which is what some of you have also talked about. And essentially what they're saying is that you look at the morals or beliefs of a particular community, and ultimately what happens is if you have the morals or beliefs of a particular community, and that's what you go by, you have a tyranny of the majority. You do not have the minority being able to express themselves or to go to places that they want to. So in order for them to do what they want to do, they have to move to another area, which then affects your right to live where you want to live. I mean, this is a further extension of how important our free speech rights are and freedom of the press. And I'm going to go to my own favorite little topic right now, because I think this was absolutely perfect timing, even though the second journalist panel didn't say that they had, what they said on the journalism panel was they said that when they get the news, they report the news, okay? Well, this is just too much. This is regarding the Kootenai County Commissioners investigating emails made by the prosecuting attorney. Both papers, can I ask for some help here? Thanks. Front page on Tony Stewart's free speech, freedom of the press versus censorship, front page regarding these emails. And essentially, if those of you have not read these articles, what the basic issue is that both papers requested certain emails through the Freedom of Information Act. The commissioners responded by not supplying more than half of the emails that they had, and by severely redacting or censoring most of the rest of them. So right here today, this is a perfect topic for us to think about and think about censorship. Whether our commissioners have the right to decide what we should see or read. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So I would leave it up to the rest of you to give us some questions and give us your own thoughts and let us know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, all of the panelists. And so for this particular portion of the panel response, what we will do is open up the floor for questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
For Linda, go right to the topics that you just mentioned. What legal constraints are they under that prevent them or require them to redact some of the information? For example, if there were medical information, was it HIPAA information? See where I'm going?
Yes, I do. There are some Idaho statutes, and I'm not going to tell you that I'm an expert on this, okay? I just barely did a brief, while I was in court today, in and out of court, I did a quick search. If you look at Idaho Code 9340 capital C, that explains to you what records are exempt from disclosure. It's pretty clear and actually pretty obvious. When they talk about personal records that are not to be disclosed, we're talking about things of a personal nature, and the statute reads, records of personal debt filed with a public agency or independent public body, corporate and politic pursuant to law, personal bank records, records of ownership of financial obligations and instrument of a public agency or independent body, corporate and politic, such as bonds, blah, blah, blah. Records with regard to ownership of or security interest in registered public obligations, vital statistic records, and military records. Nowhere in that personal nature exception is there anything such as personal emails between co-workers. Did I answer everything? Okay.
Do we have any other questions?
And
from
I just want to add,
Okay,
that's
Norm?
particularly true when those emails were conducted during when both parties were employed and on duty for the county. An email is not a very good instrument for personal communication when you're a public employee.
And I'd like to clarify, it doesn't matter what that email is. What matters is that the commissioners decided we couldn't see it. They decided that. And they don't have any good reason for that they've cited, at least at this point. And that's the problem. Even if it is personal information that maybe most of us don't want to, read the gory details about, they're going to go further the next time. What else are they going to tell us? What else are they not going to tell us? We have to be vigilant. I agree with Norm that we have to be vigilant in terms of being citizens and protecting ourselves and protecting our rights and keeping the government in line. We gave this power to the government, okay? They're not giving us the right to free speech. We have it, and we're giving them a modicum of authority to limit that speech.
Any other response from the panelists? Yes, sir.
The young folk were talking earlier about restricting rights because people were offended.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of what offends the Aryans, or what offends the major religions of our area, or what offends the other political party, and where do we draw the line at cutting back information when we don't necessarily, somebody in the community doesn't like that information. I'm sure the Aryans would gladly eliminate any conventions, meetings, public gatherings of Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and a whole host of other minorities in our society because they see that those people are offended. So it is with other groups. There's always someone who's going to be offended because I perhaps am a master mason, or because I belong to have political values they don't approve and make public statements on them. So I'd like to ask you about where do you draw the line when you are offended by what I say, and what restrictions are you going to put on me as far as the newspaper articles I might write, or statements I might make for the TV news, or any other ways that I might try to express that message if you are offended by it?
Okay, so if it's been opened up for us to ask for your personal opinions on where we draw that line between freedom of speech and press, and where then something becomes offensive to whatever particular parties in that community. Is that a fair restatement?
How do you feel about the public display of the Baha'is or Wicca witches or Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims when you don't believe in their value system?
Mm-hmm.
You find their actions offensive to your personal values. I'm not saying that I do, because
Right.
I don't. But how do you feel about it?
So would any of the panelists like to respond as to how they feel, or maybe expand with some particular situations where they feel like they've been put in that type of a spot, or any personal stories that go along with that?
I would just like to say quickly that I don't think personal judgments such that you're talking about are a good basis at all for limiting what is said in the press. I think there's some pretty good laws on defamation when it comes to actually hurting someone's business, hurting someone's reputation. But we can all be offended by a lot of things. I'm offended all the time by what's not in the paper, So I don't think that personal offense is really any basis for making that judgment. I think that, but that being said, as a society, that influence is always going to be there. If there's a majority of people who are offended by a certain subject or a certain thing, there's always going to be pressure on that, pressure to keep that out. And I think that's what the First Amendment's there for. It's a pillar of our society, and I believe that it is always going to be under pressure, constant pressure, and we have to watch that. And it is somewhat subjective, but I really think that when people are actually making an argument that I am offended by this, so it should be kept out of the press, I really don't see any credibility to that.
Thank you, Aubrey. Any other responses?
I would just like to say, when you talk about where do we draw the line, I don't know that you can when it comes to things like that are not in the press. I think it's very, very hard because, like Aubrey said, it comes down to a lot of personal beliefs, a lot of personal values. This offends me, but it may not offend Aubrey. More importantly, when it's people want to know that information, they shouldn't be denied that information, sort of an idea, even though it may offend someone else.
Thanks, Emily.
I'd say
Norm?
most of the time, freedom of speech can be actionable and wrong if action piggybacks on it. There was a case out of Minnesota where some young African American boys came out of a movie that was Mississippi Burning. Was the movie? I remember now. And one said to the other three, "Let's go beat up a white guy," essentially, and that's exactly what they did. And that was very easily their speech was not protected in that particular instance because action, it carried with it the force of action, and so therefore it's not protected. And that's a pretty easy type of case for everybody here to understand. But that's the type of where the Supreme Court has drawn the line. And the other is just plain wrong speech, where there was a misrepresentation like a manufactured good. Like years and years ago, some of us can remember thalidomide was touted as a great drug for nervous women and pregnant women that took this drug, and it was prescribed to them. Their children were horribly deformed when they were born. And they just went on selling thalidomide. And that was actionable, it was criminal, and it should have been. But they were, they could have defended on freedom of speech, but I don't think they did. But that's the type of speech that's not permitted. And those are pretty easy lines to draw. It's the other ones that really give you a lot of heartburn, those subjective ones where they exercise all this huge power of government. And you're exactly right, in just today's paper, where the county commissioners have decided for us our right to know is limited, when clearly by statute it's not limited. But they've decided it anyway, and they redacted a bunch of information that they had no business redacting. So they're going to force somebody to spend a lot of money and go to court and fight for the records.
Thank you, Norm. Any other responses?
I think what's important about free speech and your personal views is that this is something Tony has articulated in all of his classes, that you have to have a consistent philosophy. And so when you allow one group to have a certain type of speech, you have to allow the other group to have the same speech. And I think, you know what I'm talking about, Cease, right? So we talk about, all right, I want, everybody to be able to say whatever they want, but then when it comes to the Aryans, I got to say, look, they got the same right, don't I? I mean, you have to have that consistent philosophy when you're talking about and when the Supreme Court is talking about making decisions about where to draw the line.
Thank you. Jessica?
Okay. Personally, I don't have an opinion yet. Being only 18, I don't have a set idea on all this yet, but the only example I could give you is the Miller obscenity test that I believe was a result from a 1973 Supreme Court case that gives 3 different ways to determine obscenity. Should I read those or?
Sure.
Okay. One is whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the material as a whole would appeal to the pertinent interest. Second, whether the material depicts an actual or simulated sexual act in patently offensive manner. And finally, whether the material taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value.
Thank you. Does that lead to any other questions from the audience this evening? Yes, sir.
Who gets to judge those standards?
So the question is, who gets to judge those standards?
I don't know. I'm going to have to try it with the government or Supreme Court. I don't know if that's necessarily right, but
Well, I will expand on that. You learned well. First of all, there was Roth versus United States in 1957 that said 7 points in making this determination, and Miller was just, these were amendments to Roth. Roth is still in place, and there's 7 points. And what you read about Miller was correct. They tied those to Roth. So here's my question to all of you, and Norman in particular as an attorney, and Linda as an attorney. I think I'm correct. This is the only time this has happened in court. When they said that every community, Coeur d'Alene, San Francisco, Dallas, Apple, wherever it is, each community can determine the standards of that community in relation to this issue. And one community might determine that the particular book is 3 cents, and another community says it's okay. The problem with this political thicket they opened up is that I believe I'm correct to say that they now had over 100 cases on obscenity since then. They can't decide, so I don't know if any other issues ever been in court 100 times. I don't think there is one. But here is the dilemma in my view, and Norman and Linda in particular, if I don't know this, why do you confusion? I don't know of any other issue in the Constitution where the court has said it depends on what town you're in, what your constitutional rights are. So if you don't have a very constitutional rights, you get your automobile, but somewhere else to go get them. In Roth, they had the same standards for the whole country, and they changed that with Miller. You know, it's like in my car and go to Minnesota, my religious freedom is still there. If I need an attorney, I have that in any state. My privacy doesn't change, I go from state to state. But censorship does. And so when I speak to students, I say, I can't figure it out. Whatever constitutional rights I have or do not have should apply to every part of America. So I'd like to ask you to respond by saying, could you explain the rationale for that? That my automobile will determine what my rights are by moving around.
So a short form of Tony's question is that how do you explain that the censorship and freedom of speech and press is the only one that changes and varies from state to state depending upon the community at which you're in?
No, I can't explain it. I cannot explain the rationale. It doesn't make sense to me. All I can tell you is that you'd probably be more free in California than you are here.
That particular ruling where there's all these community standards is a form of government tyranny, because freedom of speech is an equal measure. We all have an equal measure of democratic power, and it can't be selectively administered in Cincinnati and Memphis and Chicago and San Francisco and Coeur d'Alene and Athol and all of the places in between. So it's just pure nonsense, and it's a way for government to wrest control from the people. What's interesting about that is that modern science, and the web, the World Wide Web, has essentially made all of these rulings ridiculous, because there is now a primary need for every family member to self-censor themselves from the prurient outpourings of the web and to protect their children. So it rests now where it always should rest, and that is in the hands of parents. And the government will find a way to try and invest its power in the World Wide Web, but they're going to have a great difficulty. It's far more challenging than to censor a particular book than it is to censor the web in its entirety.
If I take this one step further, of course it's going both ways, because when a community does do what the court said it could do, to censor that book, then it goes back to court. The court says, even on your own standard, you can't censor. So on one hand, they say do it, and then they turn around and say, but really, you don't know what you're doing, because you said something you shouldn't. So that's why there's been 100 cases.
Maybe they can't make up their mind.
In my moments of humor, I suggest they won't see it in court.
As job security. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it's apparent that obviously that's that discrepancy there with the inconsistency in the constitutional amendments, but that's the only one that isn't nationwide based consistent throughout the nation. As an alternative, I'm just curious, what would you two particularly, no offense to the other parents, but I feel like a basis of judgment, what would you offer as an alternative? And I agree that there should be, but what would be the alternative? Who's going to set that standard of what that nationwide law is going to be of censorship?
So the question is, with that being the only one that's inconsistent across the whole United States, what is our solution to the problem, and what would you lay out there as a guideline and draw the line?
Well, I'm not very wise on limiting individual power, and I'm not sure I know how to characterize that. I think you can universally make an argument that child pornography is censorable and punishable by long measures of time in jail, because principally it is an exploitation of young people who are below the age of consent. And that is a societal line that we draw at a certain age, and I think it's 18 most everywhere in the United States, and that line ought to be drawn. And that is one of the interesting areas of our society where maybe self-censoring and having individual adult members of a family where the internet is accessible to make that decision on an individual basis.
I think that, well, I agree with Norm that I think the issue is to censor ourselves, that the government shouldn't censor. For instance, like what Norm was talking about on the internet, or let's say television programs, or radio. We're really a lot more high tech now than we used to be. And I think that if someone wants to put it out there, it should be able to go out there. And it's up to us and our own morality and our own, how we choose to raise our own children, to use that technology to protect our kids or to protect myself from something I don't want to see. My recollection is that the reason the FCC is out there, or at least in part, and they censor certain types of things on radio waves, is because you go from radio wave to radio wave and you don't really know what's on there, and there was no way to censor that. Therefore, certain dirty words and other types of programs and such are, at 10 o'clock at night or afterwards. So they censored in terms of time to protect the children because we didn't have the technology. But in terms of television programs, I think that we've got that technology now in terms of internet. I think there's plenty of technology where we don't, as a government, does not need to censor those types of things. Now, I don't disagree that we need to have censorship when it comes to our military strategy. I don't disagree that there should be, actually, all they're doing by censorship and saying you can't do this is they're saying it's a crime if you do it, okay? You still have the right to say it, you have the right to do it, but you're going to accept the consequences for that. So in terms of defamation of character, you've got the right to say anything you want, but you're going to be punished for it. And I think that there are certain things that, for the most part, the U.S. Supreme Court has gotten right. Yelling fire in a crowded theater, the issues with national security in terms of, I'm not telling you I agree with the Patriot Act, I'm not even going there. But in terms of protecting the public, we all have those same mores, if you want to say it's the standard mores of what we're talking about in Miller, what a community more is. You can't, we still get in that slippery slope because not everybody agrees that you should not tell what our national secrets are. I'm not in a think tank. I'm a public defender. I work in the trenches every day. And I do also, have certain cases where some kid will tell a teacher that, use some kind of 4-letter word or 5-letter word, and then we talk about whether the kid's, if it's freedom of speech. So, we have those kind of minor issues every day in law, in criminal law, but don't know enough to fix the world.
Renee,
Thank you.
Let me just add
Yes.
another point. What Norm said, that's really important. Let me praise the court on something. They've done a lot of good things to it. Where they haven't used this and they've been right. Not on just this issue, but the court is totally right to protect children. Children don't have the same rights as adults. They have to become mature. They should be protected from lots of things, violence and materials like this that adults can see. So I just wanted the record that the court's done a real good job in that area. And that can be, and that is reform. But I was arguing on how they, as Norm is, that government should be dictating to adults, depending on what count they're in, their freedoms of the First Amendment. And so, but I really want to praise the court for protecting children. Both the statutes do it in the court decision, and they should protect children.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, sir.
What it kind of seems like is, to summarize, that the court's kind of striking down if the intention's malicious, like we are only choir in the movie theater, that's malicious. Attacking the white person in the theater, that's malicious. But what messes brought up is seeing the soldiers at Dover Air Force Base in their coffins, that's not allowed in the press. Don't you think that maybe the press is kind of overstepping their boundaries of freedom of press if the family doesn't want to have their, because it kind of calls into their right to privacy if they, because losing a loved one is a private matter, and if they don't want that seen, then the press will be overstepping their boundaries by wanting to show it.
Is that 100 comments coming in, or is that showing up at a private view?
Yeah, well, like the 100 comments showing at the Dover Air Force Base, you have that, they're in the hangar with the shiny floor and everything. I think we've all seen it on TV, and if the family doesn't want their particular, regardless of their single or name, the family still knows that that's their loved one in that room there, and if they don't want that seen, and the press is saying, oh, freedom of press, we can allow this, are they overstepping their boundaries by allowing it, or by wanting to show it?
So I think the question is, how do you balance the freedom of the press to show all the different things happening on TV so that we know what's happening, as Jessica pointed out, so it's not just numbers on a scoreboard, and how do you balance that with that it may be very sensitive for particular families because they view that as a private thing because that may be their sons or daughters that are being shown on national TV.
James, I don't know exactly how to answer that. I mean, I completely understand what you're saying. You know that a relative or a friend, somebody you know, is in there, but I still think that it would make the American people realize how much more serious things actually are over there. I'm not saying by any means that names need to be displayed so you can say, oh, well, that's this person, that's this person. But, I mean, other than that, names are given out after families are notified. So I just think it's more of a visual for people to realize that there is a serious problem over there and our troops are dying.
Aubrey?
Well, I think you have to find a balance between the rights of the public to be informed and the rights of the families to privacy. And, you know, sometimes those rights are going to conflict, and sometimes it's a matter of timing, you know, that the family should be notified before things go out on the news. But there's a lot of, I don't know, it's not really censorship. I don't think the government is always coming in and telling these media groups what they can and can't show, but they do it on their own. And it's not just the coffins. If you watch footage of the war, you see a lot of shots from embedded reporters from behind the lines. You see a lot of soldiers firing artillery, firing in urban areas. You don't see the other end. You don't see where those shells are landing or where those bullets are hitting. You know, you don't see the people that are suffering the consequences of that action. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of things that we as Americans don't really want to consider sometimes, and the collateral damage that can have an immense impact on us. But I think that has to be balanced as well with, you know, our sensitivity to those images against our need to be aware of what is happening. And I think it's interesting to look at the different media that different groups of people around the world are watching. I mean, we see the war through our media, through American media, and most of the Arab world sees the war through Al Jazeera. And I don't know if anyone here has been to Al Jazeera's website or seen any of their broadcasts, but those people see war in living color every day. They see children dying. They see, you know, all of the collateral damage every day. And that influences their opinions. And that's one of the things we should think about and I'm maybe getting off the subject here, but when we talk about different perspectives of groups and understanding different groups and the media's effect on them. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to add something you mentioned about on the war. I was in the Air Force, and during the Vietnam War, I spent a large part of that in northern Maine in a strategic air command base, and we could get Canadian television and we get American television. And the Canadian television broadcast a war in Vietnam that the Americans were losing, and the Americans were broadcasting a war in Vietnam in which the Americans were winning. And it was just absolutely dramatic. It was stark and was unsettling to see how differently the war was reported by what was an essentially neutral country, but bordered us and was friends of ours, and our own news media. And it was somebody was making highly selective decisions about what Americans saw, both on the Canadian side and on the American side. So we weren't getting the truth. We were getting a selected version of the truth throughout the whole Vietnam War era, and I'm sure it's still like that.
Getting back to a little bit about your sensitivity, I think as soon as we start censoring that, I think that might start sort of the ball rolling to censor more and more and more until the information that we want to know or need to know isn't there. As far as even our troops that are over there, I know my brother recently returned from Iraq 2 weeks ago, and over there, any newspaper they could get, any information that they can get, we want to know. Americans want to know what's going on with things that are going out, and I think censoring that, even though it is sensitive to the families that have been notified before it's broadcast, I think would just start over censoring after we got up to that point.
There is somewhat of a line that's drawn already in terms of what can be shown. If these people, like this young lady over here, had asked you, are you talking about something that's in public, or are you talking about a private service? And there is a line that's drawn there. You can kick people out for coming from your private service. But if this is out in the open, out in public, you're out there. And they can take your pictures, and they can do whatever they want to do. If you don't want them to take your pictures, then, or take a video, then you don't go there. I think that most newspapers and media are very respectful of the family's rights. If we're talking about an anonymous parade of people's, of caskets, and nobody knows who they are specifically, that's probably okay. But if they're giving people's names, and this casket is this and this casket is that, then the press, I think, normally would be a lot more sensitive to that. I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. You want to add back?
Yeah. You were talking about if it was a private service, the family could kick them out simply because the soldiers in kind of the custody of the family. At the moment, the soldier is in the custody of the United government, and they're the reason for kicking them out, kicking the kids out. And how is that different than if the family was? If they were simply because it's the government, and they were also looking out for interests. I mean, I'm sure there's some political not wanting through propaganda as well, but it could be argued that they are also acting on behalf of the family and saying, the family can kick you out of private service, this is public, and we have to say them, we're kicking you out, you cannot do this. And how is that different than if the family did?
Well, that could be what they're doing, but it's really much more likely that it's a political decision. If they don't want to show the caskets coming back, there's a reason for that. People may be more opposed to the war if they really have this brought home to them, that there are humans in there, American men and women coming back to the United States dead. That's exactly what we don't want government to do. That's exactly the issue. Why should the government censor what we see and what we hear to comport with their own agenda? And I could also go on, and I'll go back to my topic. Excuse me. We can talk about politics here because pretty much Bill Douglas, who's the person in the picture there, he's a Republican, and all of the commissioners who have decided they're not going to show us, they're Republicans. I mean, could it be that they're protecting their own? That's the whole, that's why we talk about freedom of press and speech and what we need to know. Government doesn't have a right to propagate, or those people who are elected to government don't have a right to propagate themselves and tell us their own propaganda and keep us from knowing the truth. Oh, good. We have a lot of conversation going on here.
Gentleman in the back with the red cap, please.
What would emails concern you? Were they personal emails that you're asking to get pulled up, or?
Which that's the point. The county commissioners eliminated whole sections of those communications.
Are they personal emails though?
Yeah, doing business hours.
So why is it you have access and you don't have access to somebody else's personal emails?
Because the law says we do. And because our freedom of speech and our right to know what our government officials are up to is more important than their conversations between themselves.
So they can also do that.
conceals information from you. To put up with a personal thing from my life, I was working at typewriter bank in the Philippines during the Vietnam War. I saw a message from one of the local commanders to the commanders-in-chief stating that we were able to conceal the over 150 planes that were shot down in Laos and Cambodia during the time under the topic Lost in Southeast Asia. At the time, it was illegal for our planes to go into Laos and Cambodia, and the President of the United States would make a public declaration saying we were not sending planes to Laos and Cambodia. The government does lie to us. It does conceal information from us. What happens when the reporter discovers this? What is the punishment going to happen to him when he releases those government documents, those military documents of outright lies?
Well, I don't know.
So-
There's a lot of other questions. I want to get to a lot of other people. But in the Pentagon Papers, the guy that released Pentagon Papers didn't go to jail.
Yes, sir.
So who's to hold the press accountable when they start to censor the information coming through?
Yeah.
Because the majority of the press, they run the same stories every single day, usually from the same spectrum of a perspective. So at what point, who holds them accountable for anything like that? Like such holding stories for political purposes. They get a hold of stories and they sit on it for a year and a half and they straighten them out for time. That's why I read that's trying to know about that information and they're playing games with the information just as much as the government.
So the question is, who is actually holding the press responsible? Say they have stories, they wait for a period of time, they release them at an opportune time when they actually knew at different points, and they can release them for political purposes at key times.
In answer to your first question, we are responsible. We as a people are responsible to keep the press free and moving, and we can write letters to the editor. We can start our own, quote, underground newspapers, underground radio stations to get out those types of things. Second, in defense of the press, I'm going to tell you that I don't know if you saw this morning's forum, but both the editor of the Coeur d'Alene Press, Mike Patrick, and the editor of the Spokesman Review, Steve Smith, both said that when they get the article, when they get the story, they print it. They don't hold it.
We're talking about it on a national level. I think everybody knows here that does go on.
I agree. But I don't have any way to prove that, and who has to hold them accountable? We do.
Who comes to the rescue? We can say that all day. We can send them letters, so they can easily put them in the wastebasket. You'll never know. I will never know that you sent that letter to the neighbor.
Right. Just got to be active. Be vigilant.
I think another thing to consider is that most of the media is a business, and it's beholden to all sorts of interest groups, but it's also beholden to us, the consumers. And if we let them know that we don't agree with what they're doing, that we're paying attention, that we may organize boycotts of their material, and they may not listen to that until they start seeing the percentage points, their bottom line going down a little bit, and then they will listen. And there's evidence that they have in the past. So I agree, we are the ones who have to hold them accountable.
Gentleman in the back that had his hand up earlier, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned here is that in this country, the media, the mass media, major media, is all free enterprise, profit-driven. Their first obligation is not to the public. Their first obligation is to make a profit so they can stay in business, so that they can publish the news if and when it happens. And in reference to Mr. Gissel there referring to the Canadian news to the American news, the Canadian news is government funded, as is many foreign countries are. Their news agencies are all government funded. Therefore, there is probably quite a bit of government control on what type of information is disseminated in comparison to what is disseminated in the United States.
So I didn't hear a true question in that statement.
Well, I just was wondering about Mr. Gissel there on comparing the Canadian news of the Vietnam War, which I'm tired of hearing about, to what the U.S. news was like.
I think part of my observation was that there was a lot of self-censorship going on both sides of the border. And we did lose the war, by the way, but
Yes, ma'am.
I guess my concern is, you know, I've got 3 kids and 5 grandkids, and watching this whole thing evolve, where my concerns lie is that one is the consolidation of media, whether it's a conglomerate of an arena of news, whether it's one source of information or one media source provides television, radio, newspapers, which this used to not be true, where they could not consolidate and have all of the news media. This is going to be harder to do now that we have the internet, Radio Free Idaho, and a few other things. But what do we do as people? What steps do we take? What are the things that we do to, one, reestablish the fourth estate as the guardian of our government and prevent this consolidation? And what steps do we take as individuals to watch that? I mean, there's only so many hours in the day to go to work.
So how do we as individuals work where we have more broad spread stuff, not all consolidated, not all coming out of one particular source, all telling us the same story? What action do we take? And still work and raise kids.
Subscribe to alternative magazines, newspapers. That would help at least to start, like, say, Mother Jones or Rolling Stone. Or,
I have a house full,
yeah.
but not every house in America has a house.
Right, and so we wonder, what can we do? Everybody has to make their own decision about what it is they want to do. We have to, you know, we can read, we can write letters to the editor, we can go out there and we can picket. But you're right, we're basically jammed so full with information, and we're so required to take care of house and kids and have a job and be informed and, you know, then also be the sexy wife at home for dad or husband or whatever it might be. There is too much for us to do. But each as an individual, we can boycott. So if you know that a particular organization owns a particular grocery store or has particular items sold in the grocery store, you can boycott those things. You know, those is that really going to work? Probably not. What it's really going to take is a concerted effort by some organization to really get out there. But I really think the best thing we can do at this point is just listen and subscribe to alternative papers, news releases, and then respond as best we can in whatever way we can.
What do young people feel like? How do you get your information? What do you feel like your source?
Can I answer that? I have a lot of different sources for my information, and just like you said, I don't have enough hours in the day to read all of it. But I get a lot through email, through friends of mine who find articles, search for them in various databases and various newspapers all over the world. They put them together and they send them out in chains. And I get emails from friends with, you know, up to 200 people on there, and then I take those and I email them to my friends. And this is something really new, but it's really transforming the way people communicate. And also, I tell people around me about the things I hear. I engage in political discussions. I don't listen to my boss when he tells me not to talk about politics and religion. Well, I do when he's right next to me, but and I think it's very easy for us to think, oh, okay, this change is going to happen by some large organization that's going to make this improvement for us. But those organizations don't form, and they don't have any power behind them until individuals like you and me talk about what we believe, subscribe to alternative press, and make it known that this is what we want. And changes always happen that way, glacially, imperceptibly slow. But you have to kind of love the process and wait for that moment when there's the critical mass and the people in power wake up and say, oh, okay, this isn't going to work for us anymore. We're going to have to give them at least something of what they want. And when it becomes clear that it's no longer profitable to provide infotainment for the public, and that the public really wants information, real information, then it will be provided for us.
I hope so. I feel like I'm living George Orwell's 1984. I feel like I'm living in that novel right now.
We did that from 1984.
I feel like I'm living in today.
Any other questions from the audience? Any topics that we have not addressed tonight? Something that's not been in our realm of discussion? Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's been some talk about limiting the bloggers on the internet, and I'd like to hear if there's any opinions or thoughts about it there.
Limiting the blockers? Bloggers. Okay. So limiting the bloggers on the internet, does that enter into our discussion of freedom of speech and press? Any thoughts?
Absolutely not.
In this morning's panel, I don't know if you were there after Professor Vacher and Mr. Maher, but there were a bunch of journalists there who actually addressed the issue of the bloggers. And the journalists thought they should go ahead and continue to be able to have speech. They should do that. And, from my perspective, if you want to say it, you should be able to go ahead and say it on the internet, But in terms of my understanding what the media would be thinking about, they're not thinking of limiting those guys. I didn't get that from them. Maybe, did you guys get that from them?
I got the feeling that they were saying, good luck trying to slow down the bloggers. They also, I think they raised some issues about the credibility of blogs and that there isn't really this sort of critical oversight. But one of the things they didn't point out that I think is really part of the appeal of these things is that you can listen to NBC and you hear, whoever it is, Dan Brokaw or whatever, opinion of what's going on in Iraq, but you can find a blog written by a man living in Baghdad whose, next door neighbor's house just got blown up. And it's real, That doesn't necessarily mean he's always telling the truth or that there's any credibility to it, but those sort of eyewitness accounts, I think, are really what is sort of powering the appeal to the blogs.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I have a statement regarding bloggers. I think it's interesting that bloggers are providing a little bit of policing of the press themselves, and that the bloggers are the ones that broke the story of the recent administration planting of fake reporters. They were within the reporters, and the reporters couldn't see it. Bloggers picked those out. So long live the bloggers.
Okay, any other questions from the audience this evening? Yes, sir?
Getting back to, I think, the question that you raised, and it touched on what he just said, read the Thornburg-Bocardi report that they did on CBS. What you see is the bloggers played a fairly small part, and it really was a small part. What drove that whole thing to the point that it reached was the competitive nature of business. Their competition started picking up on these things and saying there was something wrong with CBS's story. So in that respect, the competition.
Not necessarily just that story. I'm just talking about overall.
No, but
that's an example.
That's an example of where citizens at a private level raised an issue about the credibility of the
killing of documents, which they did. The news media, through their news aggregators, the RSS feeds and so on, get this stuff, and they do look at it. You go to the media sites, and they're looking at a lot of stuff from a lot of bloggers. And if there seems to be something there seems to be a little bit of smoke, they tend to at least look and see if there's something beyond the smoke. So that's part of the self-regulation, or it's part of the regulation that you're talking about. And it's not like we're going to overturn anybody anytime soon. But if enough people raise enough issues, the competition in business will pick up on it and ask the questions. I didn't have a question.
Okay, thank you. Any of the panelists have any questions they would like to ask each other this evening? Yes, sir.
Okay, let's go back to one of the panels this morning, the 11:30 panel, because there was an issue raised that had to do with how people respond to feelings of other people. And it was the Grouse Meadows homicide on December 28th, where, if what was said in the forum this morning was accurate, the Sheriff's Department asked the news media who were present not to publish the deputies' names because, again, this is what they said this morning, they feared for the deputies' mental health, that their mental health would be damaged because of that. The spokesman review chose to print the names. The Coeur d'Alene Press chose not to print the names to identify the two deputies involved in the shooting, not the other deputies who came later. So they involved the participant, named the involved participants in the shooting. Mike Patrick's position this morning was, well, and in fact, the sheriff's position was the sheriff sent out a press release saying that he felt they had shown, the spokesman review had shown a lack of respect and courtesy for the deputies. The Coeur d'Alene Press, again, did not come on the names that the spokesman review did. Which one was right, or was either of them right, or were both of them right?
So the question is, in a recent situation where the sheriff asked the press members, the reporters present, to withhold some names of deputies involved in the story. We have a situation where one paper went ahead and chose to print the names, the other paper chose not to print the names. Which of those papers, in the view of freedom of speech and press, was correct?
In my personal observation, I don't think the freedom of speech and the First Amendment is a contest of good manners. I think it is a brutal, outrageous, boisterous business, and that shouldn't pay too much attention to those types of things. The more aggressive the press is, the freer we are as a nation.
And I think it goes back to sort of what he was talking about, sensitivity, and I don't think that they're going to live. I don't think there was a right or a wrong. I think each paper sort of took their own idea of what they wanted to publish, and like he said, the more aggressive, the freer we are. But just like the coffins in the airplane hangar, I don't think people want to know it. It's a matter of public record. Why shouldn't they know?
I think that would be a very difficult situation for an editor to be in, and I think it was critical and a little bit illuminating as to the different papers' philosophy on how they go about their business. I would personally side with the spokesman, because even if it is very difficult, and I liked his answer where he said, peace officers, bless them, I caught that in there, put their lives on the line. They also put their lives in the spotlight, and as public servants, they don't have the same level of privacy that we do, and especially when they're using deadly force, it is something that we need to know about.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, I thought that what Mike Patrick had said was a different reason. It wasn't the mental health of the officers, but that the reason was so that they could complete, so that what the ISP, I think, could complete the investigation. I think that's a bogus reason anyway, but I was actually outraged when I read that and they were withholding the names. I think we have an absolute right to know what police officers are doing and when they're killing people. Even if it's justified, we have a right to know exactly who they are and what they're doing. We have a right to protect ourselves. We don't know if those police officers are whacked out. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but, you know, and it was terrible what happened to Officer Kralichek, but, you know, we have the right to know, and we should be told.
And I believe I might be wrong, but I believe one of the reasons Steve Smith said that the spokesman finally did decide to release the names was during their investigation they found out that one of the deputies who was involved in the shooting was also involved in a fatal shooting a few months earlier, and so they found that pertinent.
What I found disturbing was that they didn't answer Nils' question as to why the person who wanted to withhold at the spokesman review, why that reporter was fired. I don't think they answered that question. I didn't hear that. But I would have been interested in the answer.
So this seems like a very nice concluding spot for this evening. So I want to once again thank the panelists. Thank you so much for your insight. Thank you for putting yourself on the line. And thank you guys for attending this evening. And hopefully you can come to more of the Popcorn Forum as we're finishing out through the week. Thanks.
My views are not the views of the Public Defender's Office. They're my own. Okay, thanks.